A war had been lasting for years in French Indochina. The urban areas were mostly controlled by France, but in the countryside, well-organized rebel groups were gaining momentum. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh was leading the rebellion. He received generous funding from the Soviet Union to fight for the independence of Vietnam. The French were determined to hold the territorial expansion of the Viet Minh. They flew in thousands of soldiers to a remote valley near the border with Laos. Their goal was to counter their offensive. This valley would become the stage of one of the most epic, told, and dramatic battles of the century. This would mark a turning point in the war. It would lead to French withdrawal from the region, and it would set the stage for the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 70s. This is the Battle of Dien Bien Phu with hindsight. Dien Bien Phu is a small village in the north of the valley. It's warm and tropical year-round and is surrounded by mountains that are covered in a lush forest. The Viet Minh were well aware of the French establishment in the village, and they were actively seeking the confrontation. They were led by General Giap, who had mobilized a third of their entire army, 50,000 men in total, and they were now marching towards the valley, carrying heavy truckloads of ammunition and artillery through the mountains. The French had roughly 15,000 soldiers. Their main position was near the airstrip and an artillery fire base to the south. They set up their defenses in the 5 hills overlooking the valley, and they surrounded themselves with barbed wire and landmines. The French were outnumbered by the Viet Minh, but they had higher quality equipment, air support, and better logistics. On March 13th, 1954, the Viet Minh attacked. The first target were the somewhat isolated strongpoints in the north of the valley. This was the first major offensive, and it lasted for 5 long days. The Viet Minh were stronger, and the French ultimately retreated. This was a major morale boost for the Vietnamese, but it was a relatively minor strategic victory. The next 2 weeks, the Viet Minh dug a huge network of trenches around the French strongpoints. Every day, if a supply convoy would be en route to Isabelle, the Viet Minh would attack them, eventually cutting them off completely from the rest of the French soldiers. These were small battles, but the Vietnamese were preparing for the next major offensive. And on March 30th, it began. They left their staging areas secretly around noon, and they quietly marched towards the eastern defenses. The French spotted the attack and opened fire. At that moment, the Vietnamese attacked the central camp and the 5 hills across the river with overwhelming strength. E1 and D2 collapsed almost immediately, and the Vietnamese took over their positions. Shortly thereafter, D1 was also captured. The French were panicking, but on E4, they met the Vietnamese with fierce resistance. Heavy fighting ensued. The night fell, and fighting continued for hours, until the break of dawn. The Viet Minh suffered heavy losses, but they now controlled 3 of the 5 hills, significantly weakening the eastern defenses of the French. And at that moment, they also attacked Huguet, which was a vital position to defend the airstrip on which the French depended so much. The Vietnamese were strong, and they managed to gain some terrain. The soldiers that had taken D1 were now marching towards the river, as they were surprised by heavy machine gun fire. They retreated, and only moments later, the Viet Minh sent a fresh battalion of soldiers to try again. At E2, in the meantime, they launched another full-scale attack, but the French were at an advantage. They managed to withstand all of these attacks that were happening at the same moment, and they inflicted horrendous damages. 200 soldiers had died on the side of Vietnam, and the French had 0 casualties. This was reason enough for a major crisis of morale amongst the Viet Minh ranks. They were advancing, but at an incredibly high price. They tried to storm E2 again with 2 battalions at the same time, but they were no match for the machine gun fire and were slaughtered. But a few hours later, they went all in and sent another large number of troops. This time, they managed to reach the French. The commander of the French sent reinforcements, including 2 tanks, and the battle would continue until the early hours of the morning. The Vietnamese retreated. 1,500 of their soldiers had fallen, and 300 soldiers had been lost on the side of the French. The French were holding their terrain, and they were now also reclaiming land at Huguet. A few days later, they managed to recapture E1. Vietnam had lost all of its momentum, and at this point, the battle changed. It evolved from fighting concentrated battles for strategic points to an ugly war of attrition that dragged on day and night for weeks on end. Little by little, the Vietnamese captured the airstrip, which was so crucial for the French to receive supplies and reinforcements. The French were now slowly being strangled. Their supplies of food and ammunition were running low, and their men were getting exhausted. This lasted for a few weeks, and then the Viet Minh launched another major offensive. They attacked on all fronts at the same time, and this was simply too much for the French to handle. 6 days of fighting ensued, until their ammunition ran out, and the Viet Minh overran the city. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu was now over, and all the soldiers of the French that were left in the city were taken prisoner. This was the first major defeat over a Western colonial power in Asia, and it led to growing support and legitimacy for the Viet Minh. The timing was also impeccable. One day after the Viet Minh had won the battle, the Geneva Conference opened. The highest diplomats from France, the Viet Minh, Soviet Union, China, and the United States were all present to discuss the formation of independent states. This led to French Indochina to be divided like this. Vietnam was split into the north and the south, setting the stage for the Vietnam War. About 11,000 French soldiers were taken prisoner, and they were released only after years of captivity and negotiation. But for many thousands, it was already too late. Watch the final moments of the Vietnam War by clicking on the video on the left, or watch whatever YouTube suggests by clicking on the video on the right.